All right. So today I'm met by the wonderful Rowan Lawrence. I'm also met by Marshall Lester and Olivia Duchiquette. So, one thing that I wanted to find out first and foremost, you've been at the University of Manchester, you've been doing some teaching, and you have talked with us about some of the research that you've been doing already off mic. So, one thing I wanted to find out was how did you get started here? And maybe some of the journey before you began at the University of Manchester, how you got into the more academic side of it.
Yeah, I would love to. So thank you for having me as well. It's an absolutely fantastic setup you have here, and I'm really excited just to be able to sit and talk about my research and some of the things that I find interesting.
It's usually not that clean.
As you mentioned, I've been at the University of Manchester as a teacher for about 4 years. So before that, I did my master's degree here. So there's a bit of a story leading up to that master's degree. So I actually started with psychology at the University of Staffordshire
Oh.
as an undergrad. I'd done it at A level. I did really well in that, and I just found it really interesting, sort of the way that people behave and the way people think.
Mhm.
And it was one of the things that I wanted to know more about as a science, basically. So did my research at University of Staffordshire, or Staffordshire University. So I researched memory there as well. But while I was selecting modules as we went through the undergraduate degree, I selected some modules on sort of neurobiology. So one of the
Mm.
things was Alzheimer's disease, sort of
Mm.
the processes of how memory starts to degrade, the effects that has on behavior, the way that the neurobiology actually changes the sort of disease processes, if you
Mm.
like. So I kind of wormed my way from psychology more into, I'd say, a cognitive neuroscience sort of thing.
Mhm.
So a bit of a distinction between the two is, I suppose, if psychology is more the study of the mind and how that influences behavior, then cognitive neuroscience is more about the brain processes and how the brain itself actually physically supports um, that, for example, memory or attention or whatever cognitive process you're considering.
Mhm.
So that was really my interest at the time. Did really well in that module. Absolutely loved all that information. Did something similar for my project, and then as I was looking for master's degrees, I was thinking I want to continue in this field really.
Mhm.
So found a fantastic master's degree here at Manchester, which was um, neuroimaging for clinical and cognitive neuroscience. So with psychology, you can really look at behavior. You can measure the way that people are thinking and feeling, the way that they behave, to kind of infer what's going on in what people consider to sort of be the black box of the mind, I suppose.
Yes.
Cognitive neuroscience takes a slightly different approach, where it's like, well, we can use these new research techniques and imaging techniques to really probe what is happening at the level of the brain. What areas do we see lighting up? Where do we see electrical activity? Can we look at damage and change in tissues and infer from that what kind of effects that has on behavior and the way that you think?
Mm.
So that was a lot of what the master's course was about, and I had the fantastic opportunity to work with Dr. Dan Cox, who was my supervisor for my final project. So they had some data on individuals that had damage to the brain that had specifically affected their memory and
Mhm.
ability to encode and retrieve information. And we looked at all different kinds of physiological changes to structures like the hippocampus is a very famous one, and the cortical structures around the hippocampus that could really affect and drive change in different types of memory.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
absolutely loved that project, absolutely fantastic. I was then given an even bigger opportunity to stay on for a few months and continue to work on that master's project as an additional few steps. So we'd found that there's lots of work left to do in that. So I stayed on for another, I want to say 3 or 4 months or so, before finding out about the opportunity that I'm in now, which was the sort of 6-year PhD teaching to
Yep.
continue basically working on that information and working on that data. So I've basically been looking at memory for as long as I can remember. So
Oh.
sort of from second year of my undergraduate degree right up until now, it's just been memory, memory, memory.
Mm. Mm.
Is your main interest still primarily in neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, things like that?
uh, it's a tangential interest.
Okay.
So luckily, I'm still working on the same data set that I had from my master's degree. So that's these individuals that have sort of damage to a lot of those structures.
Mhm.
So in that sense, yes, I'm still very much interested in how does memory break down and how does change to the brain or damage to the brain affect the way that you can remember
Yeah.
things
Is
or
it
not remember things.
individual case studies or is it a really large data set?
So it's a really large data set, and it's one of the largest that we know of. We have about 75 individuals that were effectively screened for all kinds of other cognitive change. So if they had changes to their visuospatial performance, if they had changes to attention or any other facet of their cognition, they didn't participate effectively. It was just we want specifically individuals that have changes to their memory so that we can really lock down what about changes in the brain or damage to the brain leads to changes in their memory profile.
Mm. So I'm curious, what in particular interests you about studying individuals like that? Because I remember in one of my previous pods with Alex Kafkas,
Hmm.
he mentioned that it's a really wonderful way to estimate the different brain processes and where they occur
Hmm.
within the brain um, by studying how they fail.
Hmm.
So I'm curious whether it's a personal interest in understanding what does this part of the brain do, what does this part of the brain do, how is the really complex machinery, um, how can we break it down into parts? Is it something like that? Are you interested in that component of it, or do you think that there could be some potential applications for people?
So personally, for me, it's more about the understanding. I think
Mm.
there's definitely applications to be drawn, and every little thing that we learn about memory is definitely a contributor to detecting memory change in people that maybe don't have that level of damage yet, or where it could be used. But certainly for me, it's about understanding at the level of the brain, how do these different structures work together to support your memory when
Mm-hmm.
you're healthy and when it functions correctly, but also, like you said, when it fails. So there's kind of two levels to that. The reason that these sort of individuals with damage to the brain are so interesting is because you really can have an almost cause and effect relationship between
Mm.
this part of the brain is damaged. We see this particular deficit in their recall or familiarity memory, for example.
Yeah.
So therefore, we can start to draw some sort of causal links between that region of the brain and, or at least that network in the brain maybe, and this particular type of memory.
Mm.
So it's also a really good piece of what we call convergent evidence. So
Yeah.
we obviously look at imaging data. So for example, if we had a functional scan that showed us this bit of the brain lights up when someone is recalling or encoding this particular type of information, that's all well and good, but it's also excellent to have that additional piece of information that says when this part of the brain that we saw lit up on the scan was damaged in these individuals, we found that there's a systematic reduction in their ability to maybe encode or process that information. So
Mm.
to really properly understand what's happening with brain processes and how parts of the brain are supporting that information, you really do need to have those sort of links that all tie together to support it all together. And that's one of the reasons that, for better or for worse, people often research like animal models. So there you can very specifically lesion parts of the brain and say,
Mm-hmm.
I want to target this sub-millimeter square bit of the brain in, for example, a mouse or a rat, and say, now across our entire rat population that's had this particular part of the brain lesioned or damaged, what kind of behavioral change do we see? So
Mm-hmm.
obviously that's not really possible in humans, so that's why it's so difficult to investigate it with the same kind of convergent information, is
Mm-hmm.
that we have to really find people that just by chance and circumstance have those issues pre-existing.
You know, one thing that I heard from a neuroscientist that I really, really admire and have listened to a lot was that during World War II, they got a giant, giant inflow of data sets like that
Hmm.
because people were shot in the head,
Hmm.
and some of them didn't die,
Hmm.
which essentially meant they got a natural lesion in a part of the brain. Is
Hmm.
that something that you've been working with at all, or is it more recent data from, let's say, stroke patients?
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually. I wasn't aware of that. I know there's quite a lot of natural populations that kind of lend themselves well to that. Funnily enough, people that are investigating sort of changes in the brain due to alcohol,
Mm.
the UK is actually a fantastic natural
Oh,
population for that,
yes.
which, again, for better or for worse, at least we contribute to science in that way.
One day people will appreciate it. All the pubs were worth something.
But yes, that's a very good point. So, sorry, could you just repeat the last bit of your question?
Yeah, yeah, no. So I meant that in during World War II,
Mhm.
there were some data sets that were produced as a result of people basically being shot in the head. And I'm curious whether you've been working with that. You mentioned that you probably haven't. So I'll probably pivot a little bit to another question I've had, which is since you've been working as a memory researcher, as far as I understand, I'm curious what kinds of insights you got to over the last few years
Mhm.
as you've been working with those people.
So one of the
Had
big
people to.
things that across much of sort of memory research has been evident is that there's at least a small set of structures that are very crucial for
Mm.
memory. So, for example, the hippocampus is a big one. It's this nested structure in what we call the medial temporal lobes, so the very middle sections of the temporal lobes. It's this nestled structure, extremely complex, and it seems to be absolutely essential for encoding and then retrieving memories. So, if, for example, you have an episode of your life that you're experiencing, like a birthday party, that seems to be where all of the perceptual information, all of the contextual information converges and is sort of encoded together as a single experience. And it's also crucial for retrieving that information. So for several years, it's kind of been assumed that, yeah, we have the hippocampus, we have sort of structures around the hippocampus that support this memory. But it's clear now that there's huge interconnections between the hippocampus and other regions of the brain, including sort of subcortical nuclei like the thalamus, which is kind of a central hub for orchestrating information around other regions of the brain. Lots of different cortical regions like the prefrontal cortex, the parietal cortex. It seems to be really important for managing your working memory, so holding information in mind. In particular, the parietal cortex seems to be really there's several theories about what it does, but it seems to take information that's retrieved by the hippocampus and kind of store it there as a bit of a buffer, so you can kind of build up mental images. So the hippocampus is one of many structures called, well, in the literature, it's called this extended hippocampal network. So it's a whole suite of structures across the brain that are really tailored to all kinds of sort of mental representation. So from recognizing things are novel, recognizing things you've seen before, recalling associated information, drawing to mind mental imagery about episodes that you've experienced in your past, and even to an extent, sort of future thinking. So if I was to tell you to imagine, for example, 10 years from now, you're stood on the moon with a particular spacesuit on and there's, you know, a scene behind you going on, this seems to be an essential network for you to even produce that kind of mental scene in your head of something novel in the future. So I think one of the big insights is that we focus experimentally on things that we can measure very robustly, like recall. So if I give you a piece of information, can you then retrieve other associated details from that, like an episode, for example? Things like recognition and familiarity. So if I show you something that you've seen previously, can you say, yeah, I have seen that before, I recognize that. So these are processes that can be measured very robustly, but it seems that this wider hippocampal network is really essential for all kinds of mental imagery and just the things that we take for granted every day.
Yeah, so one thing that when you talk about the different processes that kind of get mashed together in the hippocampus and in other processes, it's other neural networks. One thing that is really thrilling to me, really interesting to hear, is just how different than what I'd expect the important processes are. So things like, you say, imagining yourself in the future, if I'm getting you correctly, imagining yourself in the future in some novel scenario is a separate process to, say, imagining yourself in the present. It seems like, because, you know, you often think, okay, what is the most likely process that is distinct from another process in the brain? And you'd hypothesize that, you know, maybe novel things are all in their own separate category, and then older things that you've already were familiar with are in their separate category as well. But to see that there's an even more fine distinguishing factor, like it's novel, but it's also in the future. So like it's a specific component of time. That seems like a fascinating insight into just how complex those processes can be. So I'm wondering if in your research there was some process like that which really surprised you. Like you had a hypothesis about how the brain functioned, and then it was completely subverted by the evidence of how it actually works.
Yeah, so in the patient data, we found a few sort of quirks of the way that they've been answering on tests. So you mentioned that you'd interviewed Dr. Alex Kafkas a little while ago, so you might have mentioned some of the memory tests that we used. So one of those is, for example, the familiarity-only rating task. So there we have participants are shown some information that they've seen previously, and they can either say that this is familiar, so yes, I have seen that before, but I can't really retrieve any extra details about that, and recall, so yes, I remember that, and I've also retrieved some extra details about that thing, about the time that I saw that, or some other thing that I was thinking about, which seems to be really based on the hippocampus, and looking at giving confidence ratings, so how sure are you that you recognize the thing that you saw previously? So one of the surprising things from that literature, which was kind of a big debate for quite a long time, is that the hippocampus just doesn't seem to care about what kind of information it's retrieving. If you're retrieving or recognizing something, it's always going to be active, an active participant in retrieving that information. Whereas there are other regions around it that are very, what we call material specific. So there's some parts of the cortex that are specific for objects or for faces or for scenes or other contextual information, whereas the hippocampus is just, yep, give me it all. I'll retrieve, I'll encode whatever you like, as long as it's got some input there. So that was a really fascinating insight for me, is that it isn't interested in specific types of information. It's just about encoding and retrieving, which all relates to that kind of novel thinking, future thinking. It's about sort of identifying information that you have stored or to imagine and retrieving that into conscious thought where it can be used. Another thing to note was that it's also sensitive to amount of information retrieved. So there's kind of a nice linear relationship between I'm not interested in what I'm retrieving or what I'm encoding, but as long as I'm doing that, the more you give me to do, the more I will activate. So there's this nice kind of functional relationship between what it's doing and how much you see it activate.
So could you give an example of that, for example?
Yeah, so I think Alex Kafkas also has a functional study on this. So they were given, for example, words to read. So the more abstract words where you have to sort of retrieve more information. So, for example, what's a good one? Tractor versus, I don't know, democracy.
Okay.
So when you're given the word tractor, you just bring a tractor to mind and there it is. The word democracy has a much more abstract, conceptual.
It's less imageable.
It's less imageable.
I think of the Greeks, for example. I don't know what you're thinking.
Right.
I do exactly the same thing, actually. Sort of long flowing robes.
Yeah,
sort of
exactly,
big
exactly.
Around. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So you're having to retrieve more information and work harder to produce some kind of mental conception of what that word actually means than something that's more concrete, like you said, like a tractor or a hammer or something. So the more you're giving it to do, the more it's going to activate. And this was a big debate in the literature for a long time. So there were several other labs that were looking at the hippocampus and its activation, and they were saying, no, it's not just recall. The hippocampus can do everything. It can just recognize information. It's not involved in you going, oh yeah, I have seen that before, and also here's a bunch of extra information. So one of the critical flaws of that research that my supervisors had identified was that they were using words, basically. So when you give someone a word, obviously it refers to something, so it's not just an object like a tractor, but also they were mixing together all kinds of abstract and concrete words, so that by the time the hippocampus begins to try to process those words in terms of memory, it's not just, did you see the word democracy before? It's, I've got this mental conception of democracy that has all of this additional abstract detail that I need to try and retrieve. And the hippocampus goes, yeah, that's my job. I can do that. So the sort of stringent controls that they put in place and that I've been using with those tests with the patients is really trying to nail down controlling for the amount of information that it recalls, controlling for abstractness and for concreteness, just looking at familiarity and recall really stringently controlled. What kind of patterns do we see in terms of damage to memory impairment? Another thing that they seem to have some issues with is like task difficulty. So if you give them quite a difficult memory task, controls might perform sort of at normal level quite well. But as soon as they start to get more difficult stimuli, so it's more difficult to distinguish, this is something I've seen before versus this is something I haven't seen before. Like, if you give them quite similar stimuli, or you ask them to retrieve a lot of information, that's when their memory processes start to fail, which isn't surprising given what we know about the role of the hippocampus. So even if the hippocampus itself isn't damaged, it's still effectively missing inputs if it doesn't have those other regions around it, because they're all feeding different types of information into the hippocampus that it can use to encode and retrieve. So even if we have damage to the surrounding regions with very difficult tasks where they have to retrieve a lot of information in order to perform well, you'll still see those kind of deficits. So I think one of the things that this speaks to for me is that we need a bigger collaborative effort in terms of this kind of research across the country. It's something that me and my supervisor have talked about, and that Daniela Montaldi has presented at a conference as well before, is that yes, we have what could be one of the largest data sets of individuals with memory impairment at sort of 75, but this clearly isn't enough. Like, we need to work together to gather more data to really understand at a systems level what is happening with these individuals that have damage to certain regions of the brain. So I know that was a bit of a a bit of a whirlwind, but lots of insights into recall, familiarity, and how the medial temporal lobe and the hippocampus support those processes, but also at a broader level of how do we work together as scientists. I think it's given me a big insight into, for as much as we have, we always need more to really push the boundaries.
I'm interested in your research. Sounds like it's quite high scientific quality, controlling for things like abstractness and difficulty. I'm interested in how you control for those things and how you measure and match them across conditions.
So, in the studies that we have for difficulty, for example, I'll take this as a first one. So we have some tasks called force choice corresponding and force choice non-corresponding.
Okay.
So participants are given some images to look at, so they could be faces or scenes, for example, or objects, and then when we test them, we show them those objects again, but then they're shown 3 others that are either very similar, so that's the corresponding one. So if we show them like a scene, we could show them 3 other similar beaches, and you can go, I feel like this is the one that I saw. This one just feels more familiar to me. You could also be shown 3 completely different scenes. So there, you're doing something either called recall to reject, where you go, well, I know I didn't see this particular detail because, or you're having to retrieve specific pieces of information about the thing that you did see, this beach, to be able to say, yeah, that's the one that I saw.
Okay.
So we see that the patients that have more severe damage are more impaired on that non-corresponding task because it's a more difficult task. So what we're looking at the moment to start piloting with some undergrads is perhaps to reduce the number of potential options that they have to pick from when we're asking them to retrieve information, or to perhaps, so we have some systematic data that shows which stimuli are more similar to each other. So we could use that to vary the level that the stimuli differ. So if we have some that are more similar or less similar, we could make the task more or less difficult. We can change the number of potential options that they have to pick from to make it more or less difficult. So we might see some patterns falling out in the data. But at the minute, it looks like it's mostly the more tissue loss or the more damage you have in medial temporal lobe regions, you perform worse on the more difficult task versus the easier task.
Right, and that's your evidence for the organization of that.
Yes,
structure.
yeah. So there's a lot more to do to really untangle what is going on with those encoding and retrieval processes. But we think we have some hypotheses about what might be driving it, and it's looking like it's task difficulty, we think.
And how about the measure of abstractness of items? Is that a similar process?
So this is something that Daniela and Alex Kakas have actually just published on recently. So there should be some information about this online very shortly. So yes, there are sort of linguistic databases that will be able to tell you how concrete or abstract is this particular word, and then you can systematically vary that with sort of retrieval or with activation in hippocampus. So when you look at functional activation, sort of on an fMRI scan, that shows you the amount of blood flow that you have in a particular region, and you can look at, as blood flow increases, so as activity increases in that structure, do you see a similar sort of linear relationship with the abstractness of the words? So as they get more abstract from concrete, do you see increasing
That's so cool.
activity in the hippocampus? And it seems like, yeah, that's kind of the case. So it's really interested in abstract equaling effectively, I have to retrieve more information to be able to process this word and to be able to bring something to mind, to bring a concept to mind. And you can see that reflected in the imaging data as well.
Wow. So you can see a direct correlation between abstractness and effort in a way.
Kind of, yeah. I mean, the way that I think about the hippocampus is that it's kind of obligated to do its job. So, I have this all the time where you see something that, don't think is very important, but then you can just vividly recall it later. So it's almost like it's just obligatorily taking in these inputs and encoding and retrieving things all the time. So yeah, under the hood, I suppose it is working harder, but it's not like something you consciously have to do to be able to retrieve that. But yeah, it does seem like it's having to put in more work to be able to retrieve more information, to be able to process those abstract versus those more concrete words.
One thing that really fascinates me about what you mentioned is that when someone feels that that maybe they're familiar with a concept or that they recognize it, but there's a sense of uncertainty, they can somehow feel it. They can actually perceive some strange internal process that is supposed to be completely outside of your consciousness to some extent. But then we do studies which are essentially predicated on people's knowledge of their own internal processes, like determining the abstractness of a concept. So that's something that's just, well, first of all, mind-blowing to me. But another thing that I'm considering is, how do you determine that is in fact what people are feeling when you're researching that?
That is an incredible question, and I love that because there's also a paper that my two supervisors and Daniela Montaldi's husband, Andrew Mays, who's unfortunately no longer with us now, they published this in 2019, and this was another functional imaging study where they used the familiarity rating task. So this is a fantastic point because it taps into exactly what that task is asking them to do. When you say you recognize something as familiar, that you've seen it before, and then give us a rating of your confidence that you've seen it before,
Yeah.
that is directly related to the activity that we see in regions of the brain. So I think it's a brilliant point that you made, that it's almost like this internal process that shouldn't necessarily be open to conscious interpretation, but that you can accurately say, this is how confident I feel in my memory judgment, and that is reflected directly in the amount of activity that you see in structures in the brain that are actually responsible for encoding and retrieving that information.
Yeah. So it almost sounds like the things that we're quote unquote unconscious about. So something that early psychologists have posited is the case that there's processes that are completely outside of our knowledge that are still affecting us. To some extent, it feels like we are actually aware of them to some extent if we just draw on that understanding. I don't know where you would have to look in your brain to
It's
find
just
that out.
if you really think about it and focus on it, you can actually be quite accurate in how
Exactly.
confident you are with something.
Yeah. So it's like you can retrieve a part of your unconsciousness in a task like that. And I'm wondering whether other impressions that we have, like other feelings, are also not similar to that. So maybe when we feel uneasy about something, isn't it also drawing on some subconscious
Like a
resource?
sixth sense.
Exactly, a sixth sense. That's it.
Yeah.
That's it. I think that's an idea that really, really blows my mind, and I think it's really true in the world that we say that we've got all these five senses which we can consciously observe. Like you can see that you have this perception of touch, smell, etc. But then there's also these subconscious or semi-conscious processes, like the ability to understand how abstract a concept is to retrieve, which is so hard to say, and we're also able to draw on that. So to some extent, it seems like your research is trying to help people understand different senses that they have, which are giving us the ability to really understand the world on a deeper level. And kind of following from that, one thing which you've mentioned is that the hippocampus kind of draws on different individual senses or subsenses. So you mentioned like abstractness of a concept. Then there was like the future, whether it's in the future or the past, etc. So I'm sure that there's many sub-processes like that, which the hippocampus draws together, kind of weaves them together to make a rich, vivid experience of the past or the present, or I suppose an imagined experience of the future. So one thing that I'm curious about is, were there any processes like that which you found in your research or in the research that your supervisors have done alongside you, which has surprised you? Or if not, are you working on something like that?
So no processes like that we've found. I will tentatively step into a colleague's piece of research here because I think it was a really good point that you touched on, where if I'm mistaken, let me know, but the sort of unconscious processes of the brain can kind of affect your behavior in a sense, to give you a bit of a, like you said, a sixth sense of things that are actually reflected by the way the brain is processing. So I have a colleague, another PhD student called Meg Shepherd, and she is looking at sort of the amygdala and chronic stress. So we went to a talk a little while ago. I've listened to her research quite a bit, and it's extremely interesting. But the amygdala is another region which is nestled literally up against the hippocampus, and it receives quite a lot of rich inputs from the amygdala. And this is involved in things like fear memory, sort of avoidance behaviors, potentially some like addiction and stress and that kind of thing. And she's been looking at sort of chronic life stress, and it seems like there is a direct relationship between sort of the integrity of the amygdala, like the size of it, how many cells it contains, how many projections it sends out to other regions of the brain, including the hippocampus, and the degree of life stress that you've experienced up until that point, including sort of childhood stress and adolescent stress. So that then affects your behavior directly. So you might be more likely to have mental health issues, you may be more aggressive. So this is one of those things where there's a sort of two-way relationship between what you might have experienced and the way it changes your brain. And then the reverse is also true. Those changes to the brain affect your behaviors and the way that you engage with the world.
Yeah.
So that's one of those things, I suppose, where it's not quite the same as the familiarity ratings in some sense, but it does show that there's this kind of underlying substrate of obviously brain processes and integrity of brain regions, which then has a secondary impact on the way that you engage with the world. Another thing I wanted to touch on as well, so there's a couple of recent papers that have come out, and I can't quite remember the name of the author, but one of the papers that I remember is called Memory as a Consciousness System, or Consciousness as a Memory System. So the idea there is that the kind of episodic memory that we have, where, as we were discussing, you can kind of draw pieces of information to mind, weave them into a rich internal representation, think about the future, think about the past. This is effectively a consciousness system. It's a way of allowing you to plan for the future. So the reason that there may be such strong ties between brain processes and our ability to actually truthfully state, yes, this is what I think and feel, may be because consciousness and memory are so intrinsically linked together as like an important part of our psychology and planning and ability to think effectively.
You know what? I'm sure it feels thrilling to see that you're working on something that, say, philosophers were considering for the last 4,000 years, probably. It's like, how do we define consciousness? What is it made up of? And to some extent, it seems like you're actually now capable of answering some of those questions.
Potentially, yeah. So it's always been known as the hard problem. Extremely
The
hard
hard
indeed,
problem.
because we take this sort of material, squishy substance of the brain, and suddenly we're able to think and feel, and we have sort of a self-representation and a continuation of ourselves across time. So the idea of episodic memory is actually really closely tied to that. It's something called autonoetic consciousness. So it's this idea of you having this expanded past and these events across time that lead to you as a sort of consistent single person throughout your past. Consciousness itself is, and I think it will remain for a very long time to be, the hard problem in psychology and cognitive neuroscience. So there have been some excellent studies that have looked at this. So, for example, the studies looking at the hippocampus and theorizing how episodic memory could relate to sort of consciousness systems and whether consciousness is a memory system, for example, and how that could have supported our evolution and our survival as our ability to sort of think and plan and think about the past and think about the future. There's also been some excellent studies looking at the thalamus as another potential target. So if you have some, I think it's been done in monkeys or primates actually, where they're anesthetized and then you can stimulate certain parts of the thalamus and they wake up effectively.
Oh my.
Which doesn't occur for other regions of the brain. So there's almost these sort of hubs that perhaps transmit information to other regions of the cortex that may support conscious processing. Another really interesting one is Francis Crick, one of the sort of co-founders of the DNA double helix molecule. Towards his later life and the end of his academic career, he was very, very interested in consciousness. And one of the last papers, or I think the last paper that he published, was a paper on sort of the physical basis of consciousness in the brain. I think he was editing it the day before he passed away, actually.
Oh, wow.
It was published in 2005, and this was looking at a structure called the claustrum. So obviously you have your cortex, the lovely lumpy gyri and sulci, covering almost the entire underneath of that. There's a sort of grey matter surface that's extremely thin, in some places just a couple of neurons thick, called the claustrum, and that connects to all parts of the cortex, and it sends information back to all parts of the cortex. And he had in mind that perhaps this sort of reciprocal connection between all parts of the cortex, that it then sends back those outputs, perhaps this is some kind of seat of consciousness.
Wow.
And there's been quite a lot of research to try and identify that experimentally since then. One of the ways that's obviously quite closely linked to the work that I do is to try and lesion this structure to see, when we knock out the claustrum, what kind of effects do we see on conscious processing? I don't think there's more than maybe one or two case studies in humans, and it's really not clear what kind of effects it has on people. So even though it's this huge structure that seems to connect to so many regions of higher processing that are so crucial, we can't really identify what it does even when it's absent. So it's a strange phenomena, and I think that's why it will stay one of the hard problems, because even when we think we have a good viable candidate for where in the brain is this occurring, how is it occurring, we don't seem to be able to experimentally test it very well, at least not yet.
Yeah. So, kind of building on what you're saying here, I know a theoretical approach, another theoretical approach to how consciousness kind of emerges, because I think that even the word emerges kind of suggests it. It's that you combine all of these inputs together, and only as a product of all these inputs, so as we mentioned, the sub-processes which kind of combine, for instance, in the hippocampus, only as a result of all of those things combined, you have these things which emerge, these more complex, more more abstract ideas that emerge. So I mean, even taking a little, making a little metaphor for it, you know, when you have a certain degree of consciousness, let's say like on a monkey scale or on a chimp scale, you have the ability to create little communities, and they're pretty draconian, but you have little communities and you're able to have some kind of hierarchy in society. But then when you transition into the human, now because we've just raised the intelligence a little bit, now we're able to do not only that, not only what the chimps are doing, so like hierarchies, etc., but also to create symphonies, to do 100 other wonderful things, and that kind of multiplies that diversity of the different, I suppose, the different things that we're capable of doing, because we've just raised the amount of neurons a little bit. And one neuroscientist, again, who I really, really enjoy, Robert Sapolsky, you might be familiar with him, memory research, he's a little bit related to that too. He's more in stress. So with Megan Shepherd, oh my God, Megan Shepherd told me that she actually saw him. That was just like, oh my God, my hero. Anyway, he was suggesting that consciousness is just an emergent process. That because we have so many neurons that are all kind of working together, it is a little bit like human society, where because there's so many things interacting together, that's when consciousness emerges. That's when these abstract, complicated processes emerge. And so I'm wondering whether you've been considering this kind of chaotic, emergent processes in your work, and whether that's something that that you have to consider, or are you focused more on the structural, actual things that you can test?
Yeah, so this conversation is more the kind of thing that I think about when I get home from the office. Just
Gotcha.
kind of, it's something that's absolutely fascinating to me. And one of the things that I love is that it's at least tangentially related to my own work. So I feel like I'm being productive when I'm reading all this material. For me, it's more about the structure of individual brains, I suppose. So I fully understand the idea of like we have this complex society, and it produces a lot of emergent, perhaps, phenomena that we can't account for at the individual level or at the level of the brain itself. But when I'm looking at sort of patients in my own work, I'm looking more at, I want to know exactly what regions in your brain in particular are producing these kind of behaviors and outputs. And especially because we're looking at, individuals' memories, it's one of those things where it's very easy to control and to probe experimentally. So that's the kind of thing that experimental psychology is extremely good at, is you have this individual, you can apply all these controls to them, and you can look at, in this brain, this is the output that we get given this task. So yeah, the whole hard problem of consciousness thing and its relationship to memory is definitely a kind of nighttime reading thing for me, unfortunately.
No, so it seems like there's a bit of more humility to your work, which is good, which is a good thing. I suppose I'm interested in these things because I'm an arrogant prick, but
we all in a way.
Yeah, exactly. So another thing that I was curious about, you say that this is the work that you've been doing over the last couple of years. Yeah, I remember before this point, I'm curious to hear what's kind of led up to it before you even started getting into academia. You mentioned that you seemed to be interested in psychology, but when did that interest in it, when did that passion for that subject really emerge?
So I want to say it was second year of undergrad, to be honest. So
Okay.
I was very interested in it to begin with at A level, but I was always interested in challenging myself, basically. So when I went to A level, I thought I'm going to pick all of the hardest things I can find. So I ended up with psychology, which was not very popular at my college, actually. Mathematics, physics, and economics. So a bit of a suite of of topics. So it was throughout A level, I was sort of studying psychology, but it was the sort of textbook level psychology where you're looking at sort of imposter syndrome, things like sort of the elevator experiment where you get in the elevator and everyone's turned the other way. Do you turn the other way?
Okay.
All those kind of things. So very, very interesting experiments that are interesting to see for, you know, kind of a fresh-faced 16-year-old. But it was when I really got to undergrad and we were sort of let loose and said, you know, you've got your set modules, but pick from these to find the thing that you're really interested in. Some people wanted to pick sort of criminology to investigate sort of how, when psychology goes wrong or when cognitive processes go wrong, you know, what kind of deviant behaviors do you end up with? I wanted to look more at immediately the neurobiology things. And it was during that module, reading, you know, every single day about kind of different disorders and diseases in the brain. So you mentioned like Parkinson's, schizophrenia, Alzheimer's disease. So at that point, it was quite well understood what a lot of these disease processes did, but not how they had knock-on effects on other cognitive processes. So how things might change memory as well, for example. So I was really interested in sort of the mechanistics of things. I'm a bit of a tinkerer. I like computers. I like all that kind of sort of low level, how from the ground up is this mechanistically producing those kind of effects. So I find it absolutely fascinating and a little overwhelming to think when we know about what's happening in neurons in individuals with Alzheimer's disease, for example, these are the tangles that are building up. This is the way that the cells are changing. This is the way that it affects the cortex. From that all the way up to, you know, navigation impairments and inability to encode and retrieve information. It's from that bottom-up approach that I'm just absolutely fascinated with.
Yeah.
So that's where I've kind of ended up with the more structural approach and being more interested in the structure-function relationships in my PhD.
Yeah, so kind of relating to that, one thing that Olivia has mentioned to me, and Marshall, I remember we had a little podcast together, was that she really wanted to get involved in a team of researchers who could bridge the gap between the low-level architecture of the brain and kind of combine it with the higher-level processes, so emotion or I guess the ability to make decisions, to reason, things like that.
And even complex things like social things and how the world actually operates, starting from a bottom mechanistic level and trying to extrapolate, draw those connections.
So one thing which I'm curious about, when you look at these mechanistic processes, these low-level cogs and gears in the brain, do you see parallels in the real world? So do you see how it extends to, say, someone's decision to kill somebody, for instance, or to fall in love, or things like that?
You know, that's such a complex question. I think that's the reason that a lot of imaging research is so robust and well controlled. And it's like, we want to focus in on this one process and look in this region if this particular task produces activation, is because it's so difficult to then expand that out to the wider world. So you mentioned, like, obviously social processes between big groups of individuals. Even decision making is an extremely difficult process. So there is a postdoc in our lab at the moment called Matt Westerman, who's just started, and he's looking at some research with Alex Kafkas. And we've talked about his PhD recently, and his was on decision making and effectively trying to identify, you know, kind of gambler's fallacy in an individual. Like, if you have a losing strategy, do you keep going? If you have a winning strategy, do you change it, kind of thing? And even there, like, looking at relationships between regions in the brain and structures in the brain and what your decision-making strategies are, it's incredibly difficult to pull out those relationships. So I went to a conference earlier this year called OHBM, and it's human brain mapping. So they're kind of my people, I suppose.
Yes.
And they really look at, you know, structure-function relationships, big and very big data, like tens and hundreds of thousands of people worth of data. Firstly, I think that's the level that we need to be looking at to find the kind of processes that you're discussing in terms of those large-scale networks. Another thing that was very apparent from this year was that people are more interested in, like, connectomics. So not only does this region of the brain, light up or activate when we do a particular task or this particular function, but how is it interacting with all of the regions of the brain? So, for example, the extended hippocampal network that we were talking about earlier, we've got the, excuse me, we've got the hippocampus, first and foremost, obviously. We've got the surrounding sort of medial temporal lobe cortical regions. Then you've got the entire visual stream leading up to that point. You've got the prefrontal cortex, the medial prefrontal cortex, the parietal cortex. So it's almost like when you start to look at a given process, there's no bit of the brain that's sort of left untouched
Unused.
by or unused
Right,
almost. Yeah.
right.
So you can imagine that as you scale up the complexity of these processes, like to decision making, like to social interaction, you really need to start looking at effectively whole brain processes, whole brain structures. And at the moment, it's incredibly difficult to, first and foremost, get that amount of data to be able to have the power available to analyze that sufficiently. But also just the analysis techniques are basically still being developed. Like a lot of the new research that's shown, a lot of the posters that you see as you walk around these conferences are, here's our cool new software package that does X, Y, Z, and this is the kind of stuff you can get with it. So I think that's one of the things that we need to look at, again, to draw back to what I said earlier about my conversations with Daniela Montaldi. Like, we have what's considered a very large sample of patients, but however much you have, you always need more to really probe those
Yeah.
functions properly.
I was going to ask, do you find one of the main problems is that you'll never have enough patients with the specific lesions and the specific conditions that you need, while also controlling for all other conditions that they may have, that you'll just never have enough with that specific niche condition?
That's a really good point. So one of the things that I think is really interesting about the data set that we have is that not only were we looking for just people with memory damage, but we also have damage that's maybe just to the hippocampus or just to a region around the hippocampus or just to some other area of the brain that impairs their memory. So even within our sample, we have a really big variance of not only what conditions did they have that affected their memory, but also what kind of implications has that had at the brain.
Yeah.
So it's good because you have a lot of variance. So you can say this person differs in this way and they have this different kind of behavior. But what we would love to do is have an even bigger sample of, like you said, people that have very specific damage to very specific
with
regions.
no comorbidities and nothing like that.
That is the dream.
She sounds so optimistic.
So that's been one of the things that's been really probed for a lot of case studies across time. Is we have this one patient that has this specific piece of damage, and we didn't find anybody else like this, and we have no other patients to really group them together with. And I suppose at that point you wouldn't want to, because you've got a very interesting individual there that has very specific damage that you can then get some deep data from effectively. So one of the patients that my supervisors worked with for many years was a patient called YR who had hippocampal specific damage and attended many studies, tested many hundreds of times across all kinds of different tasks in different cities, and provided a lot of extremely interesting and valuable data on what damage to that particular structure could implicate for your behavior. So obviously the ideal would be to have lots of people like that so that we could see when we control for individual quirks and individual variability, what do we still see that kind of pattern that we saw with the individual? So yeah, to draw it back, I suppose, even within our sample, we do have massive variability. And it's just one of those things where you're going to need more and more people. I think you would hit a critical mass eventually where you could say, yes, we have enough data on a specific region or a specific condition to say, yes. Sorry. Cut. To say, yes, we absolutely have evidence of this is what this particular structure is doing, this is what this is doing.
I wonder what the threshold would be for that. I mean, it's hard to say because the data itself would be quite robust by the nature of it having no comorbidity and no variance. It's just that one thing. So maybe a lower amount would be required because there are fewer things to control for. So I guess that's just a question that might be in the air in a way.
And kind of building on what you're saying, I think that, as you mentioned, I think at some point you do reach a critical mass where you have enough overlapping bell curves where this behavior is shown but none others, and then this behavior is shown but none others, where you can kind of start to see the broader patterns that emerge. So things like, this activates, this deactivates, changes into this network activates if this threshold is reached, to this behavior happens if this network of networks is activated or differentially activated. So it can be like conditionals. So it almost seems like to me, what it seems like is like a conditional process where you have an if statement, you have a then statement, and essentially that's my understanding of a neuron, an individual neuron,
Mhm.
and the networks of neurons are just that but averaged
Mhm.
over a larger group, and then whole networks are just that, just averaged over the whole group.
Mhm.
So
So
you
does
have
that seem
this,
like a good neuroscience 101
maybe
for
maybe
dummies?
yeah. So you have all these conditional processes, if thens, which together can create this really large change in behavior, or can produce behavior.
Mhm.
So one thing which I'm curious about relating to that is, and this is a bit of a logistical question, because you mentioned that we don't yet have this capacity to draw on, let's say, thousands of people who may have had lesions.
Mhm.
And so I'm kind of curious why that is, because you have a really large data set, as you
Mhm.
mentioned. I'm sure that other universities have really large data sets. Is it a question of privacy concerns and just the fact that this data is protected in some way, or is it just that people don't want to share? Why is that?
So well, it's a bit of a mix of all kinds of things,
Okay.
really, and I think two of those are absolutely correct. So the first one is that it's there are obviously some privacy concerns around individuals that have health conditions or that are taking the time to contribute their data. You want to make sure that their data is respected and kept private.
Right.
Funnily enough, we were discussing with another colleague yesterday over some coffee about how different things used to be. So we've just been moving our lab, and there's a lot of, you can imagine, quite sensitive data that needs to be handled carefully as we move across. And we were laughing because another colleague had said, when I was doing my undergrad, however many years ago, all I'd need to do was to flash my student pass, and I could get into sort of the private medical records of the people that we were interested in, and take notes and scan them at the scanner and take them
Right.
home. And that seems unheard of now. Like, you absolutely cannot do that without passing all kinds of checks. Like, it's for better or for worse. I think for better, really, because you want to make sure that data is kept safe. But yeah, the days of sort of, yep, hi, I'm the PhD, and then taking away a stack of papers is,
Yeah,
is
yeah,
unfortunately gone. Another thing which makes it quite challenging is that the patients that my supervisor has collected here, they were people that were referred as having memory problems after having some other medical episode. So it could have been some issue in the brain, it could have been cardiac arrest or respiratory arrest, things that have effectively produced some kind of damage or impairment.
Mhm.
And then they go, I'm just not remembering or thinking quite the same as I used to. They were then referred from a GP, then they were referred to the lab, then they were tested for, comorbidities, like you said, any other issues that they might have that could interact with their memory problems. And then at that point, if we found that they were, clear of other comorbidities, that they had singular memory issues,
Mhm.
and that they were fit and happy to continue, at that point, then they will be entered into the study. So there's a huge multi-year process that leads up to having the data that we do. And another thing that's incredibly exciting about this data set is that they have lots of scanning visits as well. So they get into the MRI machine, they have lots of different types of scan collected so that we can look at different aspects of the brain alongside all the behavioral data. So for these people that may have been referred from their GP with, memory issues and other health problems, they're now attending some quite rigorous testing visits and scanning visits. So there's a lot of space there for attrition. So I think that's one of the main reasons why it's why it's so difficult to collect these individuals. Sorry, I'll have to cut this bit out too.
Yeah, we cut these things. Right?
So another thing you mentioned as well. Sorry, could you repeat the last bit? Of the
Yeah.
question?
So you mentioned, how do we? What I mentioned. How do we combine all these data sets together? Is
Yeah.
it possible?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So there are some data sets that do aim to do this. So, for example, there's one called the UK Biobank, the UKB.
Yeah.
I'm sure you're aware of it. Yeah. So it's like over 40,000 people's worth of genomic data, health records, scanning visits, all kinds of things that are so useful for researchers looking at sort of epigenetic causes of different issues. Their cognitive batteries, I suppose, are not fantastic.
Okay.
But that's not their aim. That was not the thing they were driving towards.
They're focused more on medicine.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So I think that's one of the things that perhaps as cognitive researchers and as memory researchers, we should maybe try to start to turn our attention towards, is perhaps
Like
as
the
labs.
Equivalent, essentially.
Effectively, yeah. Perhaps we can start to pool together all of these novel and standard neuropsychological memory tests that we have, and then we'd have, this huge battery of tests that we could compare between. I think another thing, like you said, yes, that was your comment, is that perhaps people don't want to share the data that they have, and that is entirely understandable. Especially when it takes so many years, so much effort, and so much money to gather these patients, to then go, okay, they're online. Feel free, fill out a form and take what you need. It
Link in
almost
the
seems
description.
absurd. Literally,
Yeah.
link in the description. Yeah, it's almost absurd, I suppose, to expect people to be willing to do that. So I'm not quite sure what will need to change to allow scientists to be able to do this kind of work.
Mm.
But I think it's absolutely vital that we do start to perhaps think about more of an open science approach to the way that we use cognitive neuroscience and psychological data in these populations.
Yeah, that seems completely fair because it seems like only at the larger scales can you pick up on the really nuanced patterns that you might find really interesting to study. So I'm curious whether you have any aspirational thoughts if such a data set were possible to get.
In the perfect world.
In the perfect world.
In the
Let's say you have
perfect world.
1,000 participants
So-
with such neurological impairments that are specific to some area. What would be the study that you'd do?
So, I would love to look at how we can optimize our imaging. So, in my perfect world, where I have 1,000 participants that are really well controlled and we have lots and lots of imaging data, one of the things that I've been working at the moment is, take your nice MRI scan, what we call the T1, so that nice grayscale, high resolution volume of the brain. Yep, you can look at the regions, you can look at the shape, you can look at the volume, but crucially, there are some computational methods at the moment that are showing us there's loads of other information in there. So I'm working with one at the moment called radiomics, which is extremely difficult to explain. So it's effectively trying to extract what we call microstructure information from, for example, a T1 scan.
Okay.
So we can look at, regions of the brain and say this is how much volume there is of this particular structure, but can we infer something about the organization of the neurons themselves, how healthy the axons are, how healthy the myelin is, how dense the neural populations are there. So there are some ways to do this with some different and more expensive scans, but this is a way of getting another sort of big data set, is we can extract lots and lots of pieces of information from these T1 scans. And people have started to investigate use of sort of large machine learning models to be able to predict certain behavioral aspects, maybe certain classifications of will you then go on to progress to a certain illness or won't you. So that's one of the things that I would love to look at is, given a big data set like that, I would look at the microstructure of the brain, how healthy and integral it is. Do we then see, or can we predict using big machine learning models, what kind of memory performance you will have?
Oh, yeah. That's really interesting because it seems like then if you did have an understanding of what kinds of, let's say like pixels determine the healthiness of the brain, so you can kind of infer those things which you may not have an understanding of otherwise, you can do more with the data that you already have. So you can look at previous data, look at the picture and be like, this guy not only has, this big structure which maybe is not functioning well, but also has these substructures which seem to be functioning different than another person who may not have this issue. So it's almost like you can have a more granular understanding of the pictures that you're seeing in successive studies. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Absolutely. Yeah, so it's a way of just drawing out more information than you can basically see with the naked eye. So there are some other types of imaging that have tried to do this before. So one of them is called diffusion-weighted imaging, and that looks at effectively the movement of water in the brain. So a lot of your brain tissue is water, which is what the scan relies on. So if you have, for example, axons that are really tightly bunched together, then you're going to have water that's very restricted in the amount it can move. If it's, you've got damage to that region or some of the neurons sort of diffuse or disorganized, then you've got more diffusion of water in that region. So you can use effectively the diffusion of water in certain parts of the brain to say how healthy are the tissues there, how well organized are the neurons and the axons in, for example, white matter fiber bundles or in the gray matter. And then you can start to infer, okay, given that, you might have a completely normal volume. It might look normal on a structural scan, like a T1 scan, but from the diffusion imaging, we know, you have disorganization of, let's say, the myelin, or disorganization of the axons, or some other damage that's not visibly apparent. And my aspiration there is to say, well, that information is there somewhere in that scan.
Mm.
Let's see if we can use some computational methods to really drag that out and use that in our models to predict what kind of issues these patients might have.
So, and this question is just for me. What kinds of computational methods are you personally involved in the creation of such computational methods, or are you working with people who are capable in these areas? I am familiar with Caroline Lee Carnal, for example. I know that she is working a lot with like the machine learning side of neuroscience. I may be mistaken, but I feel that that was my impression. Just to give it a little shout out. And so I'm wondering, are you working with people like that, or are you also contributing to such models?
So I'm slightly cloistered in my work at the moment. So I'm not, although I am very familiar with Caroline's work and what she does. So at the moment, I'm sat behind my desk tinkering with code quite a lot, more often than not. So I'm implementing some code that will help me extract those features from those brain scans at the moment. And then at that point, I'll need to start thinking more about the machine learning models that I use. So I have used some standard machine learning models before, things like regression trees and XGBoost, if people are familiar with those. So things
Someone is, for sure.
I could have said anything there, I
Yeah,
suppose.
Bebop duders and so on and so forth.
So at the moment, it's more about actually getting the data out of those images, which I love to do because I love to just sit and tinker with data, basically. And then at that point, I'll need to start really robustly investigating what kind of models are going to be the best to use for this. So I can certainly see at that point I'll have some very long sit-down chats.
Oh yeah,
with individuals who know a lot more about this than I do.
Yeah, I that makes sense. I'm curious about one thing which you mentioned here. So let's say you have a data set. I'm guessing it's the same data set that you've been referring to, this big data set of those 75 patients. And I'm curious how you would create code which identifies those features that may be significant in that case. How do you even know what those features are? That's the first question.
Yeah, really good point. So there is, for things like engineering and computing, there's always someone that says we need to standardize this effectively. So you've all got your own ideas of what a particular thing might mean. Let's lock it down so that when we say, a radiomics feature, we all know what we mean.
Right.
So there's a standardization committee that has released a document that effectively mathematically defines what all of these features are.
Wow.
So when you say, oh, I calculated this radiomics feature from this brain, you can go look at the formula and say, this is the upper and lower bound. This is exactly how that should have been calculated.
Wow.
So it's about using those standard methods of extracting those features, but I'm tweaking them so I can get sort of finer grain resolution on, I want to extract features from very small regions of the brain incrementally, rather than, from whole regions at a time, to give me a sort of finer grained idea of what's going on at each point in the brain. At that point, then you can compare across, you said pixels, so they're voxels in the brain because they have volume, I suppose. They're three-dimensional chunks of the brain in our images. So there are packages that allow you to compare voxel by voxel across your entire set of patients compared to, let's say, some controls. Do you see differences at the voxel level in these features in patients versus controls? And then you can start to infer from that, what does that mean in terms of, damage to those regions?
And just so I have a bit more clarity on what a voxel is it just like a 3D whole if you consider all the pictures kind of as a layer?
Yeah, kind of. So it's more of a cube that contains some amount of tissue.
Oh, so it's a 3D it's a 3D representation from a 2D image.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha.
3D
Yeah.
pixel.
Yeah, a 3D pixel. I'm sure that the computer scientists have some way of actually describing it. Yeah. And anyway, yeah, that's really interesting. I was really surprised to hear that there is already a standardized way of understanding what is it?
Radiomics.
Radiomics. Radiomics feature is like. So how does that emerge an understanding like that?
So that's a good question, and the answer is we don't really know yet. So
okay.
This was an attempt it's a big data approach, basically. So the idea was, in medical science, we have, some patient population or some individuals of interest. We want to garner as much information as we possibly can from the scans that we have and use those to try and predict, whether they'll progress to, a more severe version of their condition or to something different.
Got it.
So this was basically a way of getting as much data as possible out of an image that's mathematically well defined. It's quite a recent method, actually, and because it was basically used just for medical science, we got these features, we predicted some stuff, we found with 95% certainty that if you have, this set of features, you'll progress to, I don't know, a more severe version of AD or a more severe version of Parkinson's. It's not been very well described in the cognitive neuroscience literature at all. So it's really a method of the last sort of 3 or 4 years.
Wow.
Um,
So you're kind of on the forefront of
I'm
it
trying,
at this point.
yeah.
Nice.
So one of the reasons that I think it's really interesting is because that means that we're not necessarily clear on, let's say you had these features that were different, in your particular patient. What does that actually mean in terms of changes to the tissue? Like, what does that mean in terms of the integrity of the tissue? And I'm basically determined to find out what that means.
Wow.
So the diffusion method that I mentioned earlier, where you look at sort of water diffusion in the brain, and that tells you things about how clumped together or how healthy axons and myelin and all that kind of thing are.
So
in
if the
white matter and
plumbing
grey
system
matter.
is working, basically.
Yes, exactly. So how do the radiomics features that we have relate to, our plumbing in the brain? Basically, is your diffusion set of characteristics related to your radiomics set of characteristics, and can then we then say this is what these features actually mean? So when you see something different in your radiomics profile, that means that your myelin is perhaps to this degree damaged or impaired, for example. So I think that's going to be absolutely crucial in terms of if you want to run cognitive neuroscience studies with this information, to identify and have that causal link between you have this set of damage in the brain, this is exactly what it means in terms of at the level of neurons or at the level of the actual tissue itself, this is the damage that's occurred, and then finally this is the effect that has had upon your behavior and upon your whatever cognitive process it is that you're interested in.
That's really interesting. I recall that Katie Moran has been working more on the hydraulics of it, wasn't she?
Yes.
Yeah, look at that. So Megan is working on the functional, the large scale stress response, and Katie's working on the hydraulics. You're working on the radiomics. Oh my god. Yeah, radiomics.
We're getting a really full picture here.
It seems like Nils has a good idea of what he's doing.
Yeah, new horizons in neuroscience.
Yeah.
Right
He's scheming. He's scheming to revolutionize the world in some way. No. It sounds really, really thrilling to be a part of work like that. I'm wondering, when you engage in work like that, do you have that thrill of, I'm the first person who's actually working on this? In some ways, I'm the first and only person right now who is doing what I'm doing.
And there's got to be some excitement in getting an alternative hypothesis.
Absolutely. Yeah. So there's always that sort of uncertainty of, this hasn't really been applied to this kind of population before. Am I doing this in the right way?
Right.
Like,
there is no right way. That's
you
the
venture
problem.
into you kind of venture out and going, well, these are the questions that we have, but how on earth do I take the data that we have and apply that in a way that actually answers them? I suppose that's the whole point of what a PhD is, really. It's preparing you to think in that way and to be able to develop the methods to answer the questions that you have. So a lot of it is kind of tinkering and problem solving and just muddling until you get the right answer, basically. But as soon as you finish and you've got, the kind of output that you expected, I don't think there's much more thrilling than that for an academic to look at that and go, yeah, fantastic. It works, basically.
Nice.
So that is a feeling that I absolutely love. And it's definitely worth all of the uncertainty that is necessitated by
the long hours of looking at a piece of code and thinking, what the hell is
what is
wrong
going
with
on?
this?
Spelling mistake.
The
Yeah,
spelling
of course.
mistakes, exactly. Oof statement. Exactly. So are you working with Python, or is it?
Yes, primarily
R?
Python, a little bit of MATLAB for sort of image analysis stuff, and R for the statistics. So nice.
A lot of people are using Python nowadays for anything related to science. It's incredible how convenient that language is.
Absolutely, yeah. I think it sets you up well for other areas as well. So, like you said, there's very few, at least academic areas, that don't use Python, and even non-academic areas as well. So I think it's one of those. It's almost like a
universal language.
It's a universal language.
Lingua
It's
franca,
a bit of a
exactly.
required skill. I'm starting to think if you can tinker around in Python, and I think the more the world develops and computing becomes crucial to everybody, I think it's going to be one of those things that's really, like you said, at the forefront of it. So.
Yep. I mean, especially one thing that is really wonderful about languages like Python, JavaScript as well, and a few others, is that you have this giant community of people
Mhm.
who have built tools for you. So as you mentioned, did you refer to radiomics libraries that
Mhm.
you've been using? Yeah, so if you have a library like that, you've probably saved yourself hundreds of hours
Yeah.
of doing it yourself.
Yeah, exactly. So, like you said, all of those mathematical functions, those functions are already, implemented there. So I can just dip in, I can pick the ones that I need, I can write my code around it, and I know that that mathematical underpinning is going to be robust because
Probably more robust than if you did it.
almost certainly.
From my understanding, usually when I try to re-implement something by myself, it's usually much worse than if I just use a library for it. Yeah, but that completely resonates with me. It's such a wonderful time to be alive, to
Yeah.
be honest, and to be a scientist, and to be someone who's actually interested in pursuing knowledge
Yeah.
to a larger extent. I mean, imagine 100 years ago, you have no one who's helping you, basically.
No, and you do everything on paper.
Exactly.
Can you imagine?
And you have this weird idea of what things are like. I
Yeah.
mean, especially in psychology.
Really standing on the shoulders of giants.
Yeah. Just
So-
constantly. I mean, even here, this is just even the
Yeah.
studio. Even the studio is not built by us.
It sounds like a lot of your work is focused on not necessarily like creating new technologies, but kind of using what we already have and finding a way to connect pieces to be able to integrate all of it and then solve questions based off of that.
Yeah.
From speaking about taking like a scan that sounds like it's relatively accessible, as accessible as MRI can really be, but then connecting that to pieces of more like obscure technology, like the water. I forget what you
Water
referred to it as.
diffusion?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
diffusion,
water
yeah,
diffusion. And then other forms of that people have used, and then taking those scans and being able to figure out how can we find signs of like data that we can learn from this more obscure scan that already exists in the scans that are more widely available, and then collecting all of that and putting it together. Is that like kind of what you see to be not like the limitation, but sort of like the way we move forward from here, is that we have this data that is available, but we just need to be able to connect the pieces and kind of find what the clues are from what we already have among like accessible to us?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what we need to do is start to have a bit of a cross,
Yeah.
a sort of translational approach to the way that we handle this kind of stuff. So obviously, the data that we have, there's lots of robust memory tasks in there. So obviously created by some of the most eminent memory theorists and memory researchers in the field, like Daniela Montaldi, like Alex Kafkas. So they've developed these tasks that are very robustly able to probe the way that people behave in terms of their memory performance, as do many other memory researchers, but they maybe don't implement some of those other technologies and some of those other computational methods to look at the data that they have in a more robust way. The reverse of that, I suppose, is that people who are more interested in developing and applying new technologies often completely overlook a lot of the cognitive theory and memory theory
Yeah.
that would actually make their outputs more robust. So you kind of have these two teams of people with a bit of overlap in the middle. Some of them are just tinkering away and they want to make new things and apply those to novel populations. Some of them want to make their tasks as robust as possible to do good experimental psychology, and they don't always communicate as much as they should.
Yeah.
So I love both sides of that continuum, I suppose, and I'd love to continue working in a kind of intermediate role where I get to have all
Yeah.
of that incredible support from people that are so good at experimental psychology and memory and task design, and to be able to benefit from, like you said, the burgeoning sort of computational fields. And since it's now so much more accessible,
Yeah.
it's something that's accessible to me as well. So
Yeah.
absolutely
Yeah.
right.
I
Yeah.
think this is a pattern that we've seen a lot, even just in our podcast episodes. We hear a lot of.
Seriously, yeah.
We just need to have people put their heads together
Yeah, people
and
need
work
to talk to
together
each
and
other.
communicate. Yeah, we make a lot more
That's
progress.
that's the fatal flaw of academics. They're
Yeah.
just like sitting in their little office by themselves.
I know that was definitely the appeal of, or not the appeal, but a big appeal for me for the cognitive neuroscience program, which is what I do, was that it's very much emphatically interdisciplinary and focused on marrying these two, like what we treat as separate fields, neuroscience and psychology, when really they are so obviously intrinsically
Yeah.
connected in terms of what they're actually looking at. And so being able to, Hugo was speaking about this earlier, and I've when I get on a rant, I tend to just not stop talking about it, but that's a large passion of mine if I ever have the ability to pursue it. But being able to at least help contribute towards that project of marrying those two things together and being able to see how we build up from like that ground basis of an individual neuron to the network to the behavior, and figuring out how we can fill those gaps in between, because it seems like there's so much like darkness kind of between the two, or not just the two, but moving from like, cellular biology and then to the structure. We're getting now, it seems like, to the point where we can actually map out neural networks and run algorithms to be able to predict how those structures like activate and then activate others, which is largely important in your research.
Mhm.
But then to get to that other step of behavior, and then beyond that, really complex behavior that occurs on the level of like societies, where you see the organization of like government and things like that, which is so cool.
It's so cool. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Is that what we always consider them as sort of separate fields, I suppose, and people are just sat in their offices with different textbooks on their shelves. But really, it's just different ways of investigating what are ostensibly the same phenomena, just at different levels. So I think it's definitely becoming more interdisciplinary as time goes on. But I would love to see more cross communication with the tools that people are using, the theories that they can share to really make each other's work as robust as possible, I think.
Yeah, something that came in my mind before, but I was hesitant to change the subject too much. I find it a bit more relevant now. We were talking about how our unconscious processes affect our conscious processes. And I was thinking back to old psychoanalytic theory, which at its time was kind of, in a way, it was all we had. And then as science progressed, we found it was quite pseudoscientific and it lacked that robustness. But I feel maybe as we go forward, we find more and more that certain doctrines were kind of true, that there are unconscious things that we're not aware of that do affect us. And it's part of, if you go from a mechanistic level, maybe it's part of our amygdala, this stress response and this heightened sensitivity. And maybe it's to do with our memory. We don't know what we really remember until you can test it with really specific, advanced scientific methodologies. There are things happening that we don't realize consciously. And there were people that were really keenly aware of that a long time ago, but couldn't prove it. So I find it quite interesting that we can, these two very separate disciplines, which is like this psychodynamic, quite unscientific at its time, and the...
Almost philosophical, really.
Yeah, exactly. And then the very, very scientific neuroscience converging. And like you said, philosophy and science converging is always really exciting.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
that was
that's
something
something
that came
that
to mind.
when we were talking with Alex, he was coming back to over and over again, was that initially the ideas which we're now studying as scientists, as neuroscientists, have emerged from philosophy. So, I mean, the study of psychology itself has emerged from philosophy. That's something that he mentioned as important. And it seems that, these questions have prompted us to go into this search, and now we're going on this very granular, deep search into how we can answer those questions. And it almost seems like, I mean, in your research, it almost seems like it would be difficult just by yourself to answer the question, why did he behave this way? But then because we've drilled down so hard into the root, I suppose, causes, the root mechanisms, now we can start to build up back to those questions again. So it seems like on a big societal level, we're trying to come back to these questions and answer them more wisely, with a more scientific grounding than we did before. Yeah, so relating to that, I'm curious whether there's any particular research philosophy that you come in with when you look at the research that you're looking at. So, I mean, in your case, you're working a lot with Python. You say that you're a tinkerer. I love that. I love that idea, and I feel like that's kind of my vibe as well. Just trying different things out and seeing what works. And I'm curious whether you have a particular philosophy for how you think it is best for you to conduct your research, and for how it is best for you to discover new ideas that may be valuable to explore.
So, two sort of separate answers to that, I suppose.
Okay.
So in terms of conducting research, especially in cognitive neuroscience and psychology, you always need to have a plan, a question that you're answering, because you end up with so many tests, so much data from individuals. It can be very easy to potentially miss the questions that you're asking, or even to answer them in perhaps the wrong way. This is one of the pitfalls, I think, of people that are developing different softwares and different technologies that don't then consider the sort of psychology of the individuals that they're applying them to. Is maybe they're not answering quite the right questions that we know about the way that people think and respond. So I think you always need to have in mind, what is my model? What am I trying to work towards? What question am I answering? And how exactly could I control for what these participants are doing? How could I get them to perhaps change their behavior, or how do I get them to respond that could best address this model? What would support my hypothesis, basically? In terms of the way that I tinker with things, it's basically break things until it works. Like, when I'm trying to teach somebody something, so for example, if I'm showing somebody else some Python code, or we're looking at, I've taught a couple people some guitar and some other musical instruments, I always show them what wrong looks or sounds like first, because if you know what happens when it breaks, then you've got a better intuition of why it broke and what went wrong. So those might seem slightly at odds, but they're at different levels, I suppose. So you're always going in with, what do I need to answer this question? What would support my hypotheses and support my model or disprove it? And then secondly, when I'm addressing that in terms of the analysis, I want to know basically what broken looks like. I need to go through and really just tinker with everything and make sure that I've got the most robust approach possible, I think.
Yeah.
I guess that approach of seeing you can learn more about something by when it's broken than when it works is exactly what you do when you look at people with brain lesions.
Yeah, I suppose that's true.
Yeah.
That's kind of the height of
That's
or the heart of neuropsychology.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's
That's the
exactly what
field.
it is.
I haven't really
And-
thought that link before, but yeah, that's absolutely right.
Yeah, you
That,
can learn more
that
about
actually is really good insight. Yeah.
specific functions of the brain by seeing what happens when those parts are damaged.
Mhm.
So, yeah.
That seems like, and this was something that we were talking with Alex as well, that essentially the process of science is predicated on finding what disagrees with your hypothesis.
Mhm.
That's the goal almost, because otherwise you're beholden to confirmation bias,
Yeah.
which essentially asserts that what I believe is true is what is true.
Mhm.
And so then you don't learn anything new because you never upset that that template that you have in the
Mhm.
world.
Mhm.
And science is about upsetting templates. It's about saying, okay, I have this idea. So you clearly state your idea. So it kind of follows from what you're saying, having this focus, having this clear hypothesis, phrasing it correctly, having the correct picture of it in your mind while you present it. And then if the research says that you're wrong, then you're wrong.
Mhm.
And that's actually, I think that's the most exciting part of science, is that something happens that you didn't expect.
Mhm.
Because if everything that you expected happens every time that you do research, then I feel like there wouldn't be much of a thrill to it. It's like, oh,
Yeah.
I was challenged by this. It's not a challenge if you're doing everything correctly. It's like a straight road towards success.
So I have an incredible example of that actually from some of our own research. So the 2019 paper that I mentioned, where they were looking at the hippocampus and that it's just sort of interested in only how much it's retrieving or how much it's recalling, and it doesn't really care about the kind of material. And this was a big upset to some previous research that had looked at the hippocampus using words, and they'd found, well, it seems to be involved in everything, familiarity as well. And our model is that, no, it's not interested in familiarity, just recall. When you retrieve additional detail, that's when the hippocampus lights up. So in that piece of research in 2019, they actually found that the hippocampus was active during familiarity for words. So they were like, this is contrary to our model. We found that it's activating for a condition that it shouldn't actually be active for. So that was then the sort of impetus for the whole abstract concrete piece of research, which tried to find what is it about words particularly that are producing this hippocampal activation. And that's where it's more interested in the abstract conceptions of things versus the concrete, because there's so much more information to retrieve, came from. So I think that's a really good example of it, where people started with a model, or with two models that they sort of battled against each other. There was some contrary evidence that was found that didn't support that model, and then that was finally explained by sort of thinking about the hypotheses and the model in a new way, and thinking about the structures and the way they work in a new way. So
Yeah.
I think that's a really good example of exactly what you were talking about, that it's more exciting to find things that disagree with you and then
Yeah.
try and explain what on earth is going
Exactly.
on.
Yeah.
Especially if there's no explanation for it
Yeah,
with
yeah.
existing models. That's when it's the most
Yeah.
thrilling.
Mhm.
And I mean, coming back to like the history of science, and I think physics is one of the best examples of how science developed, because it's got such a long history to it. When you saw the odd movement of Mercury around the sun, as we later found out, because of its gravitational, because of the sun's gravitational pull and special relativity and general relativity invented by Einstein, people were just completely puzzled by it. They were like, what is going on there? So close to us. It's literally in our ballpark, in our galactic ballpark. And we have no idea what's going on with this strangely moving planet. And so to me, it's like the most vivid illustration of what is exciting about science is seeing that I have no idea how this works. I genuinely do not understand
Yeah.
why this is moving at this strange pattern. And then someone thinking about it and saying, well, maybe our whole model is wrong. Maybe there's some underlying pattern
Yeah.
that fits all of these little details together better.
Yeah, I
So-
guess good science is like you. It's just to build off what you were saying initially. Is less like trying to prove your theory right, but trying to throw everything you have at your theory to prove it wrong.
Mm,
And maybe you do prove it wrong, and you have to try another theory and throw everything you have at that until you have a theory that you can't throw anything else at,
exactly.
and it turns
Yeah.
out maybe that it's true. It reminds me of the cognitive lab report that we just did.
Yeah.
We have the animacy effect as our theory, and we try and just test every other thing to see if it can explain it away. Like maybe it's speed, maybe it's
Concreteness.
maybe it's emotional arousal, maybe it's all these other things.
Yeah.
And we throw everything we have at the animacy effect to see if it's robust or to see if it other models are better.
Yeah.
So I guess that's a good example of good science. It's not just trying to find more and more evidence that is positive, but trying to test negative evidence against it
Mm.
in a way. If that's the correct terminology, I'm not sure.
Yeah. So I guess this brings up another question, Marshall, for you, Rowan. When you look at the literature, at one point do you know that you've got a new idea? Because the literature is so complicated always, and that's something that I personally find when I try to look at even something like a psychological research paper, which is supposed to be easier. It isn't easier because they use this strange, quaint language. And we postulate that, yes, of course. So something like that. And I'm curious, when you look at the literature yourself, how do you begin the search for a new question? How do you begin a search for a new hypothesis which you haven't considered before? Because I'm sure it's not just reading a few papers and then being like, you know what? I now have a new question. It's not a random process. There has to be some, as you mentioned, focus in how you direct your attention. But how do you realize what to focus on? I guess that's the question.
So a couple of things you can do. I always sit and just read as much as I can get my hands on, basically. And I'm kind of old-fashioned, so I like a nice paper copy, and I sit with a pencil, and I make notes in the margin. And mostly
It's more
those notes
vivid
are
that way, isn't it?
genuinely, you feel more in touch with what you're doing. So normally you'll be reading through, and someone will make a statement, or there'll be like a piece of information, and you'll go, "Oh, why?" Like draw a question mark next to it. So you might see that pop up again a couple of papers later, and you'll go, "Oh, I should Google this and see why." And if you don't find an answer, that's usually a good point.
Wow.
Another thing you can do is review articles are an excellent source of inspiration. So they're not systematic reviews, but they do give a good overview of here's the field and where is this field today, basically. And they can give some good insights into maybe these things aren't as well supported as they could be. Maybe we could have a look at these questions, and then you can then use those as, I suppose, fodder for going off and looking more specifically.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That's a good answer.
Yeah, that sounds like a useful way of approaching it. Particularly the review articles. Usually, from my understanding, they're written by the foremost experts in the field. Written/reviewed by the foremost experts in the field. So I know, for instance, in what was it? Self-Control, there is a guy. His name is Mike Baumeister. I don't know if that was exactly his name, but definitely his surname is Baumeister. And I remember reading a review paper where he was talking about, the correlates of self-control and all the effects that it has. And it's just so beautifully put. It just gives you this insight that you wouldn't get, I think, in any other context, other than perhaps to read a book by a person like that. So like Thinking Fast and Slow, there's a few gems like that are really fascinating. But otherwise, the only way that you can access the minds of those foremost researchers is through review papers that they make or through their research. So I often found that the most excited I was about the scientific pursuit was when I was reading a paper by a researcher who seems to be at the forefront of the field. Because it seems like their insight into it is literally, there is no one else who has this kind of insight. And it seems like you're at that point in time, you're literally at the forefront of knowledge.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
So they kind of, I suppose, crowdsource a lot of what the questions could possibly be. So they're
Mm.
looking across their research of interest, their scope of interest, and saying, okay, given where we are today, what kind of questions are there available to pick up on, I suppose. So yeah, I think that's an
I think
excellent
we have
point.
a common theme here. Just
Yeah.
like emerging properties, emerging phenomena, like
Exactly.
how do we integrate things and then build up from there.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
that's right.
It
In
seems like
science.
those podcasts are almost scripted. So
Yeah.
yeah. Because
They're not.
usually when we hone in on a topic, it actually remains somewhat around that area at least,
Mhm.
which is really, really interesting. Like with Kafka's, it was around a little bit around the philosophical basis
Yeah.
of science and how it relates to memory, of course. And then for other researchers, it was something as like Jennifer McBride. It was very much about innovation in education, from my understanding. So that was a very big part. But anyway, this was a thrilling interview.
Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you.
Rowan, thank you so much for coming and joining us along here. Thank you, Marshall. Thank you, Olivia.
Thank you,
This was
Hugo.
really
Thank you.
nice.
Always
Thank
a
you very
pleasure.
much. I've really enjoyed it.